It's finally happened, guys. I have started watching Jojo's Bizzare Adventure. Well, technically I did a year ago, but then I stopped, and then I started again. And I liked it quite a decent amount. I think it's pretty solid so far. I say so far because I'm only about like 1/4 into part 4 right now, so I mostly want to make this video about parts 1 through 3 because I've finished those parts, and I don't want to review something unless I've actually finished it or at least caught up to it. So part 4 will not be reviewed today, but if you subscribe and like the video, you'll be able to see when I do review it though. You heard me. Subscribe to the damn channel. Anyways, what was I talking about again? Oh yeah, Jojo's and I have a pretty rocky relationship, to say the least. I planned on not touching the series for a while because it just didn't seem like my type of thing, but one day I got bored enough to finally look at it and say, there could be worse shit on Netflix, and gave it a go. When I watched part 1, Phantom Blood, I wasn't really impressed. Part 1 seems like something that's a big product of its time, both in style and how the characters act. I knew from the beginning that part 1 was like really short and only took up like 7 episodes, so I still decided to continue on past that point because part 2 was apparently a lot better. I can appreciate that part 1 is a lot shorter, but that also only really adds to how forgettable it is. This part just feels like a far cry from what the series shifts into later on, and while I don't think it's entirely awful, I just didn't care for it all that much. And by the way, I'm going to be strictly talking about the anime, not the manga, as I have not read it, so if you have a point about the manga that the anime did differently, I simply just can't take that into account because that's not the medium I've consumed the series in. So now let's move on. When I got to part 2, Battle Tendency, I was pleasantly surprised with how good it actually was, because Hamon was still the power system, and it's the part I probably heard the least about at the time. But so far, it's honestly my favorite part in the whole fucking franchise. Now part 4 is coming close to dethroning that and probably will when I finish it, but so far part 2 is the best, and that mostly has to do with Joseph Joestar, the Jojo protagonist at that time. He's like everything that Jonathan wasn't, and that's probably why I like him so much and why I don't like Jonathan. He's still a good guy at heart, but at the same time he's a lovable asshole that's energetic and funny. When it comes to the Pillarmen, there was nothing special in terms of character about them, but they were cheesy in a way that worked more than part 1. Their cheesiness and silliness made them a lot more fun. This part embraces a lot of the weirdness in JoJo's, and that's where it shines its brightest, because there's like no reason to hide the fact that this show is goofy as shit. 80% of the time in this part, it doesn't feel like you're supposed to take it seriously, but when you do take it seriously, it's pretty damn serious. Caesar's death didn't impact me that much emotionally, but I could sympathize with how Joseph was feeling about it, which was more than enough for me to be moved by the scene of his death. Joseph is just super easy to root for. Even if he isn't the best person ever in terms of morals, he's a fun troll that you really want to watch succeed. His adventure is incredibly fun. The fights were good, nothing special but still entertaining. Hamon is improved but is still a pretty basic and unoriginal power system, but overall, I really liked part 2 a lot. It's really good. I would even go as far as to say that I loved part 2. And before I get to part 3, I think I want to make one thing very clear for that review, and that's that this part is very risky and takes a lot of chances that most authors typically wouldn't. Araki basically changed his whole story and its structure for part 3, and I can respect that. However, with such a drastic change in powers, style, and story structure comes a lot of things that both work really well and don't as much. You see, when I finished part 2, I was looking forward to more JoJo. Part 3 was, and still is, the most popular installment of the series and is the most memed on and iconic of the original 3 parts. But then something happened. About 20 episodes into Stardust Crusaders, I felt like I was going nowhere. I felt like nothing was happening. I was getting super bored, and so I just stopped watching JoJo's. The most popular part made me drop the series for an entire year until after so much pushing and shoving from other friends to continue the series that I finally picked it back up again. When I did pick it back up, I just restarted part 3 because I was so bored with it at the time that I didn't remember anything. And if I'm gonna review something, I want to make sure I remember it well enough to give a fair opinion on it. My main issue with part 3's first half is that the entirety of this whole "we need to go to Egypt" goal goes on for super long, and it felt as if we weren't ever gonna arrive there. We stayed in point A and didn't get any closer to point B for the entirety of those 20 episodes. A lot of episodes just kind of felt like filler. I do understand to an extent why it's as long as it is, because this is when we get introduced to the stand system after all, and we do need time to develop that power system and fully understand it. And I get that. I get that a lot. But my problem with this is that it felt like a lot of these episodes were focused on nothing other than introducing us to different stands. Sure, the abilities are interesting, but for the most part, the actual fights are kind of exhausting to watch because of just how many there are. A lot of the villains are just so forgettable and boring and repetitive too. Like, there's nothing that stands out about basically any of them in these first 20 episodes besides Whole Horse. And most of the time, it doesn't feel like the full extent of how cool stands can be are fully explored in a lot of these episodes. There are some episodes like the one where Polnareff gets tied to a bed and has to escape, and that's pretty entertaining, but that's an exception in the first half. There's also a lot of ideas that just went nowhere at times. Like, my main example of this is this one girl named Anne, I think that's her name in the anime. I don't know if that's the same name she has in the manga, because I remember someone saying that it's different in the manga. But she tags along with the group and starts crushing on Jotaro, but they ditch her like multiple times, and eventually she just stays gone and out of the story. She was such an empty and pointless character that contributed nothing to anyone else's development, not even Jotaro's, despite her attachment to him. And yet she has a lot of emphasis put on her in these early episodes. And it's just like, why? When we do get to Egypt, there is a light increase in quality, but for the most part, it's still pretty inconsistent. But I will say there are a lot of fun episodes in this batch compared to the other half. The beginning of the Egypt half of the adventure starts out strong with the introduction of Iggy and the desert battle against Endul. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing that. Every episode where Whole Horse appears in is a fun episode because he's a fun character. It's clear to see why Araki wanted to originally make him a member of the team at first, but I'm glad he stayed as an antagonist. The Oingo Boingo brother episodes are hilarious as hell too, and the Darby gambling battle was probably one of the best episodes out of this adventure before the last 10 episodes, which yes, I'll get to that later on in this video. When Polnareff turns into a baby and has to stop a stand user and save a woman just to end the episode off by not telling her the truth about him at the end was really cool, and I really appreciated it because it showed us some real growth in his character. A YouTuber that I humbly respect and enjoy watching once said in a video that JoJo characters don't have character arcs, which I don't really agree with at all. Polnareff is my main example for this. He starts out as a very immature guy despite being a lot older. He still has his code and goals and stuff at the start, but for the most part his outlook on the world is very childish at the beginning. But he goes through many events in the story that progress him into becoming much more mature by the end of Stardust. He probably learns the most life lessons out of anyone in these episodes. The Vanilla Ice episodes show him at his lowest point because of how he ends up losing Avdol and Iggy, and yet he still finds his resolve in the end and is finally able to stand on his own 2 feet and take care of business on his own and truly avenge the ones he had lost by himself. Something I brought up earlier too was the episodes where he turns into a baby. The ending of that episode shows the woman he saved recognizing him as the kid that saved her, but instead of sweeping her off of her feet and trying to do some Mordecai shit, he says he doesn't know her and keeps moving forward, which is something that he would not have done in the episodes before this one. Not at all. A lot of my favorite moments in part 3 come from Polnareff, and that's because he's the character I connected with the most. His personality was fun and charming, he's hilarious and has some of the best gags in the show, and even with all that, he still has the most fleshed out development out of any of the Stardust Crusaders. He's definitely my favorite of the bunch besides Joseph. Joseph doesn't grow too much throughout this part, but that's because he already went through enough growth on his own. By the end of part 3, you definitely feel like Joseph had matured a lot in those many years skipped to the point in this story, while still feeling true to the character that we saw in part 2. His speech to Jotaro when he got Fake Out killed perfectly encapsulated the essence of who he is as a person, and if it was the final nail in the coffin for him, it would have been a perfect send-off speech for the old man. This part does justice to his character by showcasing how much he had matured and grew as a leader and as a friend before the events of this story. But while I do like those two, and Iggy too, I like Iggy a lot, I can't say the same for every Stardust Crusader. I really can't say they all stick the landing. Kakiyoin and Avdol are the ones I'm mainly going to be talking about, and I'm going to start with Avdol because it's much easier to explain. The guy's just kind of bland. He has a fun design, but past that there isn't much there to his character. He lacks personality, which is kind of necessary, especially for a show like this. His Fake Out death doesn't help his case since he was taken out of the story randomly, but even throughout throughout Egypt, he just feels like, I don't know, a cheerleader? He doesn't get many episodes where he can shine like Polnareff does, so he never feels all that special. And while I think his death has a really nice sense of irony to it, it still doesn't take away from the fact that he died at the literal start of that battle. And that's kind of all there is to say about Avdol. Now let's talk about Kakyoin, who I was also disappointed by because he's one of the most beloved characters in the entire series. Now there definitely is a character arc to Kakyoin, and his regret from his past as well as some overcoming his fear and trauma do add depth to his character, but this arc is developed and presented very poorly. He also gets taken out of commission for a little bit, which once again doesn't help his case, especially since it's right before the climactic fights of the series, and he doesn't ever truly get the spotlight aside from maybe 2-3 episodes until the final battle. His death was more shocking to me than it was emotional, and while I can respect that he was a significant part of beating Dio, that doesn't justify how subpar his character felt for a lot of this adventure. Now I will admit he is probably my favorite design of the Stardust Crusaders and a cool stand design too, but I'm starting to believe that's probably the main reason people like him. Again, there is an arc for his character, but in my opinion it's just not presented all that well. That's the main problem with Stardust Crusaders, in fact. There's not a good balance in terms of how these characters are developed. You can get a really good sense of which characters were favored more when writing them, and which ones got the boot in terms of focus and presentation. Polnareff gets a lot of time to develop, Joseph gets a lot of screen time and focus on himself that he doesn't even really need, but Kakyoin and Avdol don't get that same treatment at all. They got sidelined pretty heavily. With them out of the way, it's time for me to talk about Jotaro finally, because he is the main character, and I have a lot of thoughts, both good and bad, about him. Because in all honesty, he somehow manages to be one of the most overrated but also underappreciated characters in the series. Once again, there is a character arc to Jotaro despite the many people who believe otherwise. Although it is harder to see with Jotaro because he's a lot more stoic as a character, and his development and moments of progression is very subtle. He starts out as a dumb, edgy teenager who does a lot of dumb things, which is sometimes too edgy to make him likable, and doesn't really like to open up to or trust others. As time goes on, you can see subtle changes in Jotaro that start to make him seem a little more mature than he was the last time we saw him, such as the submarine episodes when he's on the phone with his grandma, or in the most obvious case, the finale when he finally lets his emotions out against Dio, which despite Joseph's warning, ends up helping him defeat the world. Jotaro definitely does grow as a character in the story, which is something a lot of people may not catch on to, which is okay, because once again, it's a lot more subtle and a lot of people aren't going to catch on to that subtlety. However, there are still criticisms of Jotaro that are still very valid. Due to him being very stoic and edgy and cool, it makes his personality hard to connect with, and he isn't all that relatable, which in most cases is a need for a protagonist, especially in shonen. For a lot of part 3, I wasn't really feeling him or connecting with him at all. He just felt kind of lifeless and bland. Though the finale when he starts letting his real emotions out was really cool, he doesn't really do anything similar to that for the series before that. He's almost always so calm and collected. No one even gets close to breaking him, and when you feel like he's struggling, he actually just outsmarted the villain and proceeds to pummel them to the ground. I'm generalizing a bit there, but that's how he feels most of the time. These issues make his relationship with pretty much every member of the crew besides Joseph feel really artificial for a lot of the story, which makes it even more difficult to resonate with the other characters as well whenever the plot is deciding to follow Jotaro. The structure of the season doesn't do him any favors either, because there's a lot of episodes where he doesn't have the focus on him, since another Stardust Crusader, typically Polnareff or Joseph, is getting the main character spotlight, which is fine for those characters, but it takes time away from developing Jotaro, who needs a lot more screen time in order for a character like him to work. Now, I do like him a lot better in part 4 so far, since his character archetype kind of works in the role he plays in that part more than this one, but I feel like there was a lot of potential that was missed with Jotaro, and while still a respectable character by the end of part 3, still leaves a lot more to be desired. With all that out of the way now, I finally want to talk about the finale, because my god, it is fucking awesome. Now, the last 10 episodes of Stardust Crusaders are all pretty damn great, but I've addressed them more than enough to get my point across for them besides the finale. This finale is one of the best in anime. Every minute of every episode from part 1 to 5 was so tense and full of suspense that never left your body until you finally saw Dio go down. Dio has been hyped up as one of the most iconic villains in all of anime for a long time, and while I didn't really care for him that much in part 1, I absolutely do see the hype for him in part 3. Now, he isn't one of my favorite favorite villains ever, not by a long shot, but he fills out every single box that makes a villain great. He's intimidating, he's scary, he's powerful, he has a charm to him that makes him difficult to hate because he's so much fun, and most of all, he raises tension as soon as he shows up, and he steals the fucking show. He kills Kakyoin with ease and damn near kills Joseph and Polnareff too, and for a while, you're questioning whether or not anyone besides Jojo will even make it out of this alive. Thankfully, my two favorite members survived this part, so I can brag about that. Now, Dio isn't anything deep or complex as a character, but he doesn't really need to be. His simplicity is why he works in part 3. All you're being given is reasons why you should be terrified of this guy, and that's exactly what happens. The guy is goddamn horrifying. So yeah, the finale of Stardust Crusaders is cinema, and the second half of part 3 for the most part was pretty solid. The first half is kind of a boring slog, but once you get to Egypt, there's a lot more fun to be had. So for the most part, I liked part 3 pretty well, despite its inconsistencies and its flaws, and it's definitely got me excited to continue JoJo's. The finale does carry my enjoyment of it a lot, but there are some gems within part 3 that are still pretty solid. I'm loving part 4 right now, so I'm gonna review that when I finish it, and probably do a whole review series on JoJo's for every part. That's if you guys do want to see that. Let me know. I don't care if you disagree, Polnareff is awesome, he's the best character in the show so far. Him and Joseph, they share the #1 spot for my favorite JoJo characters right now. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to talk about today. I'll see y'all next time. Bye bye. Jesus Christ, I can't fucking breathe.